A few local officers figured they'd welcome me to their town in a warm manner by tying me to a lamppost in the middle of the street, putting on a performance as if I were just another nobody. Little did they realize who they were really messing with and how this would backfire on them. Let's rewind to the beginning. The deal is this. My name's Danny, 54. I've been around the block a few times and recently moved to this tiny, out-of-the-way town in South Carolina to take on the badge as chief of police. This isn't my first rodeo. I've seen plenty over my time, but this place had a vibe like no other. Everyone seemed to know one another, and they didn't appear thrilled with fresh faces. It didn't take long for me to notice that the local cops appeared to enjoy following their own rulebook, if you catch my drift. On my first day before checking in, I decided to take a walk and assess what I was dealing with. So, there I was, blending in with my old jacket and worn-out cap, just another guy on the street. I walked into this local cafe, the kind of establishment that seemed older than me, and the moment I stepped inside, I could feel a dozen eyes on me. You know the type, the classic "you don't belong here" vibe. Two officers seated in the corner were cracking up about something, but I could tell I was the punchline. They kept sneaking looks at me, sizing me up, having already decided I was a nobody worth ignoring, or worse, worth messing with. Their badges practically sparkled in the dim light, but their manners? Not so much. I ordered a coffee, trying to play it cool and gauge their reactions. I had no intention of revealing who I was just yet. This was merely a recon mission. But just as I was about to take my coffee to go, one of them barked from across the room. "Hey, old man, you lost or something? Because you sure don't look local." I half-turned, keeping my expression neutral, replying, "Just passing through," though it was evident they weren't buying it. The tall guy with the smug grin shot back, "Well, maybe keep passing. Strangers don't last long around here, if you get my drift." I shrugged and walked out. But believe me, I could feel their eyes on me with every step I took down that street. Something told me my new job was about to involve way more than just paperwork and meetings. The next morning, I decided to go for a run just outside of town to clear my head and get familiar with the area. Fresh air, a little peace. Everything was pretty normal until, halfway through, I heard the sound of a patrol car pulling up beside me. Yep, those same two from the cafe, Jake and Mike, the dynamic duo. Jake, the tall, wiry blonde with that smirk, leaned out the window and called, "Hey, runner, you lost?" The way he said it, you'd think I had trespassed onto private property with a huge no trespassing sign slapped on my forehead. His partner Mike, a solid guy who looked like he could bench press half a car, chimed in, "Yeah, are you sure you're welcome around here?" I maintained my cool, slowed my pace, and replied, "Just going for a run. Pretty sure that's still allowed around here, right?" Mike shot me a grin, one of those annoyingly smug, "I know something you don't" types of looks. Allowed maybe, but strangers don't exactly get the warmest welcome here, especially those who don't know our rules. Before I could open my mouth to ask what in the world that was supposed to mean, they jumped out of the car. Jake stepped uncomfortably close and started patting down my pockets without so much as a "may I." I took a breath to keep my composure as they rummaged through my things, throwing smug glances at each other as if this were some sort of game. Finally, Jake pulled out a random scrap of plastic from my pocket, his face lighting up with some twisted excitement. "Well, look what we have here," he sneered, holding it up like it was a trophy. I simply stared at him, not taking the bait. It was painfully obvious they had this little setup planned. At this point, I'd had just about enough of their friendly welcome, but I knew I had to maintain my calm. They didn't have a clue who I was, and this definitely wasn't the moment for a big reveal. I played it cool, even as they each grabbed one of my arms and yanked me toward the center of town. No explanations, no questions, just dragging me along like I was some lost pet they had found wandering the streets. They took me straight to a big lamppost in the middle of town square, where folks were milling about doing their usual morning routines. A few onlookers stopped, curious, while others didn't seem surprised at all, as if they'd witnessed this kind of spectacle before. Jake and Mike appeared to be staging some sort of twisted show, cracking jokes as if they were at a comedy club. "Oh, ladies and gentlemen," Jake announced with a mocking bow, "we've got ourselves a real big city troublemaker here." Mike, playing along, added, "Yep, think he's got a few tricks up his sleeve, or maybe in his pockets." They tied my hands around that lamppost in a dramatic fashion, making sure everyone could see. Some folks began pulling out their phones to record, as if this was the highlight of their day. Others just chuckled, shaking their heads. I could see Jake soaking it all in, gazing at his audience with a smirk that turned my stomach. He leaned in close, loud enough for everyone to hear, sneering, "Looks like we've got ourselves a troublemaker, huh? Can't have people like you just waltzing into our town." The whole situation was beyond ridiculous, but it wasn't funny. It was unsettling. These guys were so caught up in their act that they didn't care how transparent their setup looked. I had seen some low moves in my day, but this was something else. I reminded myself to stay calm and let them dig their own hole. And there I was, tied to that lamppost like some kind of public attraction while Jake and Mike strutted around as if they had just snagged the year's biggest catch. They didn't even attempt to keep it low-key. These guys were basking in the attention, with people filming from every angle, chuckling, shaking their heads. Some folks even seemed genuinely curious, probably wondering what in the world was going on with this outsider in their town. It turns out that little scene didn't remain a local secret for long. By the next morning, clips of the mysterious stranger tied to the pole were going viral online. Comments were flooding in, and boy, did the theories start rolling. Some people thought I was just a drifter who had crossed the wrong lines, while others were outright calling out the cops, asking, "Who's this guy? And why does he look like he's stuck in some old Wild West show?" People wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. Local news caught wind of it, with a few journalists arriving for their next big scoop, relentless as they pushed through the crowd, miking up to catch a quote or two. One even cornered a bystander, asking, "What did this man do? Did anyone see him commit a crime?" The response was a shrug and a muttered, "Beats me, looks like the cops are just having some fun." Meanwhile, Jake and Mike were still riding high, pacing around like they owned the square, cracking jokes, and making a scene like local celebrities. If only they knew how quickly the story was spiraling out of their control. Watching it all unfold, I felt a spark of anticipation. They were handing me exactly what I needed, setting the stage perfectly without even realizing it. The spotlight was on, and soon enough, the real show was about to begin. After a long night, trust me, it felt like the longest night ever. My phone rang early in the morning. The caller ID showed it was the main office, and I knew exactly why they were calling. Word had reached up the chain, and they weren't pleased. This little town's idea of fun had morphed into a full-blown scandal, and Jake and Mike were about to receive a rude awakening. I strode into the station calm and collected, feeling the weight of my uniform as I put it on. This wasn't just another day at the office. This was my moment to set things straight. With my badge gleaming and my uniform crisp, I made my way to the main hall. You could almost hear the tension in the air building up like the calm before a storm. Just as expected, in walked Jake and Mike, laughing about some inside joke, carefree without a thought. They hadn't bothered to check who I really was. They had simply assumed I was some nobody they could toy with. But the second they spotted me standing there in full uniform, they froze. I could see shock spreading across their faces, slowly morphing into something that looked a lot like panic. I let the silence stretch, watching them squirm, their eyes darting around in search of an escape. Finally, I broke the silence, my voice calm yet firm. "We've got ourselves a situation, gentlemen," I began, locking eyes with each of them, "and you're both right in the middle of it." The color drained from their faces as they realized what was happening. This was a scene they hadn't scripted, a game where they had lost control. Jake attempted to stammer out an excuse, but I raised a hand to silence him. "Save it, Jake," I said, my tone icy. "I've seen enough to know exactly what's been going on here." I stepped closer, looking Jake and Mike square in the eye, and asked, "So, neither of you recognized your new chief?" The room went dead silent. You could practically feel everyone holding their breath, witnessing a slow-motion train wreck they couldn't look away from. Other officers began glancing at each other, wide-eyed, finally putting two and two together. Jake and Mike stood frozen, desperately trying to exude confidence, but their expressions gave them away. They were cornered, and they knew it. I pulled out my phone and hit play on the video. Their little performance from yesterday, complete with all their smirk and mocking comments. I held it up for everyone in the room to see. In case anyone is confused, this is what transpired. These two thought they could have a little fun at the expense of some stranger without even bothering to ascertain who I was. The rest of the team watched in stunned silence. Shock turned into something closer to disgust as they began to realize how far these guys had taken their antics. Jake looked like he was about to speak, maybe try to explain himself. But then he did something I hadn't expected. Instead of apologizing, he squared his shoulders, lifted his chin, and said, "Look, this is just how things operate here. Tradition, you know. We like to have a bit of fun with the outsiders. It keeps people in line." His voice held a defiant edge, as if he still believed he had the upper hand. I raised an eyebrow. "So you've got a tradition of publicly humiliating people simply because they're new in town?" Jake smirked, searching the room for support. "It's not hurting anyone. Just a bit of harmless fun." I scanned the room, taking note of the disbelief and discomfort on my team's faces. They were finally beginning to grasp the depth of this issue, and for Jake and Mike, The severity of the situation was sinking in. Their little tradition had just reached its end right there in that room. Within days, Jake and Mike's act had exploded like a summer wildfire. This was no longer mere local gossip. The story had spread far and wide, from city talk shows to state news channels. Reporters camped out in front of the station, and cameras seemed to be everywhere, ready to capture every last detail. The town had never experienced anything like it, and honestly, neither had I. The community was furious. Folks who had previously turned a blind eye or chuckled at Jake and Mike's antics were now demanding accountability. There were protests outside the station, with people carrying signs calling for justice. It was like a brewing storm that no one had anticipated, and it wasn't about to let up until those two faced the consequences. I called a meeting and gathered the entire team in the main hall. This wasn't going to be a quiet warning or a polite reminder. This was me drawing a line. I looked around the room, my gaze landing on each officer, making it clear this was no longer just about Jake and Mike. From this point on, I stated, my voice steady but firm, any behavior that disrespects the people in this community will be met with immediate termination. No warnings, no second chances. There was a heavy silence as everyone absorbed this, realizing that things were about to change significantly. Jake and Mike stood off to the side, their faces pale as it dawned on them that their little game was over. They weren't untouchable anymore, and everyone was aware of it. Without another word, I reached into my pocket, pulled out 2 termination forms, and signed them right there for all to see. Jake, Mike, hand over your badges. Your time here's done. The whole room watched as I handed the papers to them. There were no cheers, no applause, just a heavy silence as they removed their badges, their faces finally reflecting an understanding of the gravity of their actions. The message was clear. From now on, the town's officers were there to serve and respect every resident, not to treat them as a sideshow. After Jake and Mike's hasty departure from the force, the real fallout began. The prosecutor's office stepped in, determined to investigate the traditions these two had been running. They started digging into every arrest and every questionable call made by Jake and Mike. Believe me, it didn't take long for a mountain of complaints and accusations to begin piling up. People who had remained silent for years finally stepped forward, sharing stories of how they had been bullied, humiliated, and worse, all for Jake and Mike's twisted sense of fun. It was as if a floodgate had burst open, and suddenly the entire town was talking. This was no longer just about one incident. It was about setting things right for everyone they'd wronged. Before long, the courtroom became the center stage, with people demanding justice, compensation, you name it. Jake and Mike were staring down more than just a pink slip. They were facing serious consequences. The town was finally receiving a glimpse of what true accountability looked like, and it was evident they were not about to let these two off easily. As I stood outside the station watching the community come together, I knew this was exactly why I had taken the job. This town was prepared for change, even if it required a bit of shaking up to get there. The message was loud and clear. The days of turning a blind eye were over. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace, knowing we had turned a corner. The fight for respect and justice didn't end with Jake and Mike. This was merely the beginning. The town now understood that things were different, and I was here to ensure they remained that way.